It was supposed to be a simple hike, a day trip through the forest, just my friend Alex and me. We had planned the route carefully, marked it on our maps, and packed the essentials. It was the kind of forest that beckoned with its untouched beauty. Towering trees, thick underbrush, and silence broken only by the occasional bird call. A perfect place to escape from the chaos of city life. We started our hike early, following a well-worn trail that wound through the trees. The path was familiar to us, or so we thought. The day was clear, the sun shining through the canopy, casting dappled light on the forest floor. The air smelled fresh, earthy, with a hint of pine. But as we ventured deeper into the woods, something felt off. It wasn't anything we could put our finger on, just a growing sense of unease. After a few hours, we decided to take a short break by a stream. Alex was sitting by the water, fiddling with his camera, while I looked around, lost in thought. That's when I noticed it. The trail behind us seemed different. The markers on the trees, which had been clear when we first set out, were now faint and hard to spot. It felt as if we had strayed from the path, but we both reassured ourselves that it was just the natural changes in the forest, nothing to worry about. We decided to keep going, thinking we could retrace our steps. But with each turn, the forest grew darker. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches twisting in unnatural ways, as if they were reaching for us. I remember feeling like we were being watched, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. I shook it off as nerves, a byproduct of being so deep in the woods. Hours passed, and we still hadn't found our way back. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest. We didn't have enough light to find our way back easily. Panic set in, and we decided to call for help. But when I pulled out my phone, there was no signal, just the cold, empty screen. That's when we realized we were completely lost. The sense of unease had turned into full-blown dread. We knew something was wrong, but we couldn't explain it. The trees seemed to loom taller now, their bark twisted and gnarled. The forest wasn't just dark, it was oppressive, as if it were alive, breathing around us. We decided to keep moving, hoping that we would find the trail again, but the more we walked, the further off track we seemed to get. At one point, we heard footsteps behind us. Slow, deliberate steps, like someone was following us. We stopped, in our tracks, straining to hear, but there was nothing, no one. We couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there with us. But whenever we turned around, we saw only trees. We pushed on, but the forest seemed to twist and bend in ways that didn't make sense. We should have reached the trail hours ago, but we kept finding ourselves in the same spot, the same patch of trees. We tried to use the setting sun as a guide, but the forest felt disorienting, like it was changing around us. Then, just as we were about to give up, we stumbled upon something that shouldn't have been there. A small clearing with a wooden shack in the center. It was old, decrepit, its door hanging off its hinges. But the strangest part was the markings on the ground, strange symbols carved into the earth. I had never seen anything like it before, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. We didn't dare go inside. We turned to leave, but the moment we did, we heard a voice. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. "Leave this place." The voice came from the direction of the shack, but we couldn't see anyone. It was as if the trees themselves were speaking to us, warning us away. We ran, not looking back, the forest closing in around us. It felt like the woods were alive, their branches reaching out to trap us. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, we found a road. We followed it until we were back at the edge of the forest, and we didn't stop running until we reached the nearest town. We didn't speak much on the way back, too shaken by what we'd experienced. To this day, I can't explain what happened in those woods. I don't know if we were lost or if something more sinister was at play. But one thing, here's for sure, I've never gone back to that forest, and I never will. It had been years since I visited my childhood home, a small cabin nestled deep in the heart of the forest. My family had moved when I was young, but I still remembered the woods surrounding our property, dense, quiet, and full of life. So when I received a letter from my mother inviting me to spend a weekend at the cabin, I jumped at the chance. The idea of returning to the place that held so many memories was comforting. When I arrived, the cabin seemed as I remembered it, old, yet cozy. The towering pines that surrounded it still seemed as imposing as ever, their branches swaying in the wind, whispering something unintelligible. The sun was setting, and I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of nostalgia mixed with unease. That first night I stayed up late, reminiscing and listening to the sounds of the forest. The wind howled through the trees, and the crackling of the fireplace added to the warmth of the cabin. But as the night grew darker, I started hearing something else. A low, whispering sound coming from outside the cabin. At first I thought it was the wind, but the whispers grew louder, and I realized they were too distinct to be natural. I stepped outside to listen, trying to make out the words. The whispers were coming from the trees, the pines that had always stood so tall around the cabin. They seemed to sway in time with the wind, their needles rustling in a way that sounded almost like speech. The longer I stood there, the clearer the whispers became, and though I couldn't make out the exact words, the tone was unmistakably menacing. I quickly went back inside, locking the door behind me. The last thing I wanted was to encounter whatever was out there in the dark. But the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to follow me, growing louder as the night went on, until they filled the entire cabin, creeping into every corner of my mind. By the time I lay in bed, the sound was unbearable. It was as though the forest itself was alive, trying to communicate with me, trying to tell me something. I tried to ignore it, but sleep eluded me. My mind raced with fear, and I kept thinking back to when I was a child, how my mother used to tell me stories about the forest. She would speak of the old legends, how the pines were said to be haunted, how they whispered in the night, luring people deep into the woods. I dismissed those stories as childhood fantasies, but now, in the dead of night, surrounded by the very trees she had warned me about, I wasn't so sure. The next morning, the whispers had stopped, but a heavy sense of dread lingered. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the wind. But as the day went on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every time I went outside, I could feel the eyes of the forest on me, the towering trees closing in, suffocating the space around the cabin. That evening, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. I ventured out into the woods, telling myself that the old stories were just that, stories. But as I walked deeper into the forest, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and the whispers began again. This time they were not distant, but right behind me, as if the trees themselves were speaking in my ear. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the pines, swaying gently in the wind. The whispers seemed to grow louder, more frantic, as if urging me to go deeper into the woods. Something was pulling at me, a force I couldn't understand, and before I knew it, I was walking farther and farther into the forest, my legs moving without my consent. I don't know how long I wandered. The path I had followed seemed to disappear, and the trees became more twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The whispers surrounded me, their words now clear. "Come closer." I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart pounded in my chest. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just the wind. The forest was alive with something darker, something that had been waiting for me all these years. I tried to turn around, but the forest seemed to twist and change, disorienting me. The path I had taken was gone, replaced by an impenetrable maze of trees. It was then that I heard something else, footsteps, slow and deliberate, following me. I turned again, but there was still no one in sight. Panic began to rise in my throat, and I ran, blindly crashing through the underbrush, the whispers growing louder with every step. Eventually, I stumbled back to the cabin, breathless and terrified. The door was still locked, but I felt as though I couldn't escape the forest. It had already claimed me. That night I didn't sleep. The whispers were back, louder than ever, and they weren't coming from outside anymore. They were inside the cabin, in the walls, in the floorboards, in the very air around me. I knew then that the forest wasn't just haunted by spirits or legends. It was something much older, much darker, and it was calling me. In the morning, I packed my things and left the cabin. leaving behind the forest that had once felt like home. I never spoke of what happened that weekend, but I know the whispers still haunt me, calling me back to the pines. It was the perfect day for a hike. The sun was high, the sky a brilliant blue, and the air was fresh with the scent of pine and earth. My friends and I were eager to explore the dense woods that bordered our small town. We'd hiked these trails countless times before, and nothing out of the ordinary had ever happened. But this hike would be different. We set out early, following the familiar trail that wound through the trees, the sound of birds overhead and the rustle of leaves beneath. Our feet created a peaceful rhythm, one that helped to ease any tension we might have had. It felt like any other hike, and I had no reason to suspect that anything would go wrong. But as we walked deeper into the forest, something began to change. The air felt heavier, the trees more imposing. It was as though the forest itself was closing in on us. The path became less defined, the ground uneven, and the trees seemed to grow taller and closer together. We kept walking, unsure of where the trail was leading us, but trusting our instincts to guide us through. About an hour into the hike, we stopped for a break. We found a small clearing by a stream and sat down to rest, enjoying the cool shade of the trees. I took out my phone to check the time, but as I glanced at the screen, I noticed there was no signal. This wasn't unusual. Our town was surrounded by thick forest, and cell service was spotty at best. What caught my attention, however, was something else. As I looked around the clearing, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees watching us. It was a man, tall and thin, with a long coat that seemed out of place for the warm weather. His face was obscured by the shadows, but I could feel his eyes on me, unblinking and intense. I nudged my friend Jake and pointed toward the figure. He looked up, but by the time he turned his gaze to the trees, the man was gone. There was no sign of him, no movement, just the stillness of the forest. We all shrugged it off, assuming it was someone else out for a hike. But the feeling of being watched lingered, and I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. We continued on the trail, but the unease never left. The woods felt different now, darker and more oppressive. The air was thick, heavy with an energy I couldn't explain. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure from earlier, but there was nothing, just the trees and the silence. After a while, we came to a fork in the trail. One path led deeper into the forest, and the other veered toward a ridge that overlooked the valley. We debated which way to go, but I had this inexplicable urge to head toward the ridge. I felt like I had to. I can't explain it. Something was pulling me in that direction, and though my friends were hesitant, they eventually agreed. As we hiked up the ridge, the forest grew quieter. The birds had stopped singing, and the wind had died down. It was as though all the life in the woods had vanished. We reached the top, and I finally allowed myself to look around. The view was breathtaking. The valley stretched out below us, the distant town barely visible through the trees. But just as I was about to relax, I noticed something in the distance. A figure, standing motionless at the far edge of the woods, just beyond the tree line. The same man. He was staring directly at us, his face still hidden in the shadows of the trees. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I turned to my friends, but they hadn't noticed him. They were too busy admiring the view. I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest, but I tried to keep my voice steady as I called out to them. "Guys, we need to go. Now!" Jake and the others looked at me confused. "What's wrong?" Jake asked. "Look over there." I pointed toward the trees, but when they looked, the man was gone. There was nothing but empty forest. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that I had just seen someone else out hiking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there, watching us. I insisted we leave, and, though my friends were reluctant, they agreed. We quickly turned back down the ridge and retraced our steps along the trail, my eyes constantly scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The further we went, the more I felt like something was closing in on us. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush made my heart race. It was as though the forest was alive, watching us, and the man was following us, never far behind. When we finally reached the clearing by the stream again, we were all exhausted. We sat down trying to catch our breath, but I couldn't relax. I kept scanning the trees, waiting for the figure to appear again, but there was nothing. The man was gone. We made it back to the trailhead without incident, but the sense of unease lingered. As we left the woods, I looked back one last time, half expecting to see the man standing at the edge of the trees watching us leave. But there was nothing, just the empty forest. I never went back to those woods. I don't know who the man was or why he was following us, but I know one thing for sure. He wasn't just some hiker, and whatever was out there in the forest that day was not something I ever wanted to encounter again. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. My friends and I decided to go camping in the forest, far from the noise and distractions of the city. We picked a secluded spot deep within the woods, away from any hiking trails or other campsites. The area was serene, quiet and untouched, perfect for a weekend escape. The first day went without incident. We set up camp, had a fire, and spent the evening chatting and roasting marshmallows. But when the sun set and the darkness of the forest surrounded us, something changed. It was subtle at first, just a strange feeling, like we were being watched. I chalked it up to the isolation of the location and tried to ignore it. That night, as we lay in our tents, the wind began to pick up. The trees swayed, their branches creaking, and the sound of the wind was unnerving. Then came the first noise, a faint rustling in the bushes just beyond our camp. It was too quiet to be an animal, too deliberate. I nudged my friend Ben, who was lying next to me in his tent. "Did you hear that?" Ben sat up, listening intently. "Yeah, I did. Sounds like someone's out there." We both held our breath, straining to hear. The rustling stopped for a moment, and then came a soft footstep, then another, slowly, like someone was walking around our camp, deliberately avoiding making noise. I grabbed my flashlight and crawled out of the tent, trying to see anything. But the beam of light only illuminated the trees, casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. Nothing was there, just the darkness of the forest. We all stayed quiet the rest of the night, too scared to speak. But the feeling of being watched never left. Every time we tried to sleep, the rustling would start again, as if someone was walking just outside our camp. It was impossible to ignore. We spent the night huddled in our tents, too terrified to move. The next morning, we packed up quickly, eager to leave. But as we were preparing to head back to the car, I noticed something strange. There were footprints around our campsite, deep, heavy prints that didn't match any of our shoes. They were too large, too spaced out. Someone had been circling our tents while we slept. I don't know who or what it was, but something was out there with us, watching us the entire time. I haven't gone camping in the woods since. It was a late autumn afternoon when I decided to go for a solo hike in the forest near my cabin. The leaves were just starting to turn, casting the woods in a fiery orange glow. The weather was perfect for a hike, not too hot or cold, and the quiet of the forest was exactly what I needed to clear my mind. I'd been on the trail many times before, and it was well marked, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. But this time, something was different. As I walked deeper into the woods, I began to notice subtle changes. The air felt heavier, as if the trees were pressing in on me. The familiar trail markers seemed further apart, and before I knew it, I found myself off the beaten path. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest had transformed. The trees seemed denser, the trail less defined. It was as if the woods had rearranged themselves overnight. I pulled out my map and checked for any signs of where I might be, but it was useless. The landscape had changed, and I couldn't make sense of it. I tried to call for help, but my phone had no signal. I was completely isolated. I started walking in what I hoped was the right direction, but the deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to twist around me. The path became narrower, and the trees seemed to close in on me like a maze. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As the sun began to set, the forest grew darker, and I realized I had wandered too far. Panic set in. I knew the forest could be dangerous, especially after dark. That's when I heard it, a distant voice calling my name. I froze, my heart racing. The voice was soft at first, as if it were coming from far away. But it soon grew louder, closer, more urgent. "Come here," it whispered. "You're almost there." I looked around, my breath caught in my throat. There was no one in sight, just the dark, looming trees. But the voice continued, growing clearer with each passing moment. "Come here," it repeated. "It's safe now." I ran. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get away from that voice. But the harder I ran, the more disorienting the forest became. The trees seemed to close in around me, blocking my way. And the voice. It was following me, always just behind, calling my name. Eventually I stumbled out of the woods, exhausted and terrified. When I made it back to my cabin, I never told anyone what happened. But I know one thing for sure. Whatever was in those woods was still out there, watching, waiting.